It's game 7 of the Women's World Championship. We are halfway. 6 games have been played and Lei Tingjie is in the lead with 3.5, 2.5, 5 draws, 1 win. So Wenjun is under pressure, and now we have left Shanghai. The remaining 6 games and possibly even a tiebreak are going to take place in the city of Chongqing. And let's see if Wenjun is able to bounce back. She really needs to win at least one of her next remaining 6 games. Today, she's playing with the black pieces. Lei Tingjie opens up with 1 e4. This is what she has been doing throughout the match so far in all her earlier white games. And then Wenjun played e5. Very solid repertoire. But now, for today's game, round 7, she goes for the move c6. We have a Caro-Kann on the board. d4, d5, knight d2, d takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop f5, mainline theory, knight g3, bishop g6, h4, intending to trap the bishop, h6, so the bishop can always drop back to h7 whenever it's needed, knight f3, and here black has a number of interesting options, but definitely e6 is one of the sharper continuations, inviting white to come in with a knight to e5, attacking this bishop on g6, and you don't want white to take it, as that would ruin the structure on the king side. So bishop h7, bishop d3, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and now the move knight d7. So far this is pretty standard, and white has tried a lot of different ways of handling this position. You can trade off the knights, but generally simplifications are gonna help black. So that's not the main line. A more common idea is to advance the pawn to f4 or play bishop f4. In both cases, you're trying to support that knight on e5. But Lei comes up with a very interesting move. It's the move queen e2. So the queen leaves the d file, so avoiding any potential exchange of queens. Knight gf6, and here first novelty of the game, and it definitely is one which caught the reigning world champion by surprise, as in previous games a lot of people went here for the move bishop e2, bishop d2, with the idea of castling queenside. Very typical way of playing these lines in the Caro-Kann. Usually it leads to positions with opposite castled kings, but here Lei goes for the move castling kingside, and this is a very rare idea, but it has been seen in a few computer games. And I remember having watched some video of English Grandmaster Matthew Sadler, in which he covered this exact position, mentioning that it does make sense to leave the pawn on h4, even though it's vulnerable. It can come under an attack of a queen or possibly the bishop. But white has a very clear idea. Let's see what's going to happen. Bishop e7. And now the rook comes to d1. So that it's eyeing the queen on the d file. In case black would consider to take, you recapture with the d pawn. Castling kingside. White plays c4, grabbing space, depriving the black knight from coming into d5 anytime soon. And here, queen a5 played. And well, it's interesting because Wenjun was definitely caught by surprise, as I said, and she had to invest quite a bit of time. She was already half an hour down on the clock at this point. And it seems to me that Lei was doing pretty well. She knew what to do in this position. Played here the move bishop f4, getting the bishop out, and rook a8. So now, interesting moment once again. As a typical strategy for white in these positions, and it was also mentioned by Matthew Sadler in his video, is this move rook d3. When white is looking for ways to include the other rook into the game, you can double rooks on the d file, and later on a rook lift is among the ideas, and not having placed the pawn on h5, which is a typical plan in these Caro-Kann positions to attack the bishop. Now the pawn is on h4, and that means that you have additional ideas of playing knight h5, and with the rook on g3, there is tremendous pressure against the pawn on g7, against the pawn on h6. So white is looking for ways to build up an attack. However, the question is whether rook d3 at this point is the most precise way of playing, and I believe a slightly more accurate way of handling the position is the move a3, so that this rook will never have to be concerned about the protection of the pawn on a2. And well, there are some advantages which I'm going to show you later. Rook d3, knight takes e5 played, and d takes e5. That is the main idea, that you're aiming for a symmetrical position, one open file, you're attacking the knight on f6. And here, a big moment, very interesting moment as well, as in the game, Wenjun just moved her knight away to h7. Looks a bit odd, but it's very logical in fact. But I should point out that rook takes d3 is also a possibility. And you may recapture with the queen, but then also rook d8 can come with tempo, hitting the queen, so black conquers the d file. But probably black refrained from playing this because of e takes f6 as an in-between move, attacking the bishop, attacking the rook. But now you got to give back the material with the move bishop d6, so that if you take the rook, you take the bishop on f4. And obviously, if white instead would capture the bishop, there is rook takes d6. So very tricky position, very sharp, and well, I'm not sure this is what black was exactly looking for. So black tried to play it safe with knight h7, knight e4. So this is the point of playing for the open file. The knight was not doing that well on g3. Now intends to come in to d6, which is a fantastic outpost. But white's going to pay a price for it, because the pawn on h4 is just hanging. Rook takes d3, queen takes d3, bishop takes h4. So that is the pawn. And obviously there are no longer any sort of attacking ideas for white. Though it should be said that white is pretty active with a knight on d6. You're closing the d file. So black's major pieces are not able to become active there. In certain cases, the pawn on b7 is hanging. But the move queen b6 is played, hitting the pawn on b2 as well as the pawn on f2, as both the bishop and queen are attacking that pawn. White played here queen e2. And black is a pawn up. I believe black is absolutely fine here and can be satisfied with her position, especially if you just go back with your bishop to e7, with the idea that at some point you would like to swap the bishop for the knight. You're not in a rush. You can decide under which circumstances you would like to do that. You can play c5, you can play rook d8, and slowly try to untangle. And in the long run, that extra pawn is going to be worth something for sure. But instead, rook d8 was played first. Understandable, but not very precise, as it does weaken the pawn on f7. A very tempting move here would be queen h5, attacking both the bishop and the pawn on f7, but it runs into queen takes f2 with check. King got to go away, and then you capture this bishop. Therefore, white has to do something about it first. Plays the move bishop to e3, attacking the queen. Queen got to go away, went back to c7. But now the move queen h5 is played. The queen, the black queen, covers the pawn on f7. So you got to do something about the bishop. But the bishop is not able to come back to e7 because of queen takes f7. Here you see the advantage of that beautiful knight, the octopus dominating black's position. So black instead played here bishop g5 offering exchange of bishops. White is not interested, played f4, and the bishop is in big trouble. What should black do? Cannot move the bishop, because if it goes back to e7, pawn on f7 will be taken. g6, only move to attack the queen, counterattack. And now the pressure against the pawn on f7 is gone. So the queen goes back, but now also the bishop is able to come back safely, putting pressure on this knight on d6, c5, and now of course taking the knight on d6 is no longer attractive, as white is going to recapture with the c pawn, and then you have a beautiful protected passed pawn, tremendous compensation, space advantage. Knight on h7 is still out of play. It will take time for that piece to return into play. So black comes up with a different plan. Plays here b6, undermining that support of the knight on d6. White goes b4. After b takes c5, you do recapture with the b pawn, but now the b file is open and black is no longer interested in d file, goes to b8, intending to enter with the rook at some point. And the question is, what should white do? White is a pawn down. I think it would have been very important to prevent any sort of counterplay with a move bishop d4, so that you cover the b2 square. And now it's very important to realize that this queen from c7 cannot really become active, as if it goes away, you got to reckon with this pawn on c6, which is a liability. But white played differently. White played here the move g4. And this is typical. When you're under pressure from a psychological point of view, you feel like you feel the urge of proving your compensation. And here, I don't think Lee had any concrete ideas, but she was hoping that at some point the rook will come to the f-file, maybe f5 can be played, and open up the king side to launch some sort of initiative against the black king. Queen a5, that's the key move. And now the queen is doing excellent. And the reason why this is such a great move is because queen takes c6, runs into queen c3 with a double attack against these two unprotected pieces. Black is winning material. So the pawn cannot be taken. White played here the move rook f1. So the rook is safe. Now queen takes c6 is an idea. And you may protect the pawn here with queen a4. I think this is a very interesting move, as the queen is controlling the fourth rank, hoping that if white's ever going to push the pawn to f5, for instance, now you have this move bishop g5, and things are incredibly sharp. But it should be noted that if bishops are going to be swapped, then the knight comes into g5. The knight is a fantastic piece. And after f takes g5, f takes g, white is not really able to give a check on f7. The king will come into the corner, and now we see why this queen is doing fantastically on the fourth rank with the big plan of taking the pawn on g4 with check. So no queen a4, instead queen c3 was played. It's also very interesting with the point that the queen can still not take, as the queen keeps an eye on this bishop on e3. And well, the question is, what should white do now? And I think things are not that simple, at least from a practical point of view here for white. Maybe just trying to consolidate your position with rook f2 is interesting, so that you can hide with your king on the second rank, and it will be very difficult for black to utilize its extra pawn. Also, a move like f5 could be considered, but after take, now the queen is able to take the pawn on e5, and things are everything but simple. Black is in great shape. So Lee instead played here the move knight e4, but I think this is already a sign that things are not going well for white. The knight was basically your best piece. Now it drops back. Okay, it does attack the queen, but queen can go to d3, keeping in touch with white's pieces. And one of the ideas is, of course, to go rook b1. So, for instance, if you play f5, rook b1, putting pressure against the rook, so you're threatening to take, and after queen takes, the bishop is hanging on e3. If you take on b1, it's check, king goes away, and now it's queen takes a2. That is a second pawn. So you got to be very careful. Therefore, instead of playing f5, king g2 is played. And now rook b2 check. And here you would think rook f2 is the way to go. But after rook f2 take, you cannot take with the queen. Then the knight is hanging. If you take with bishop, then queens can even come off the board. Well, if you take with a knight, okay, where's white's initiative? It definitely evaporates. Queen goes to a3. Staying in touch with the pawn on a2. Pawn on c6 cannot be taken because the bishop will be hanging. I don't think white is going to be satisfied here with her position. So in the game, there followed bishop f2, which is probably a good pragmatic choice. And since black is a pawn up, training of queens seems to be very tempting, and you can even win a second pawn. Black is 2 pawns up, but things are far from simple, because now, since the rook is able to come in to b7, hitting this bishop, always be able to give a check, attack the pawn on c6, white's pieces are simply more active than its counterpart. So black didn't want to go for that line, instead played here the move queen d5, keeping queens on the board, and after rook d1, it's queen takes a2. Black, once again, is 2 pawns up. Now, if the rook enters on d7, the bishop can just go away. The bishop on f2 is pinned. I don't see the counterplay. This looks great for black. So after taking on a2, there followed f5. White is desperate, looking for counterplay. ef5, gf5, gf5. Queen takes f5. Wow, what's happening? Black's king is open, but you see that both the bishop and the knight, they are covering quite a number of squares. But here, I think Wenjun relied too much on general principles. By playing the move queen e6, she offered the exchange of queens, but as we will get to see in the game, after the exchange of queens, the rook comes in on d7, and you're hitting the bishop, you're attacking the pawn, and activity is usually more important than the material. Just want to go back 2 moves. Instead of playing queen e6, black is not in a rush playing this move. You can always consider this option, but the main problem is this knight on h7. That needs to be brought back into play, and I think knight f8 is an excellent move, so that if you go for this move, queen e6, you are at least covering the d7 square. You may even take back with a knight. You can come in with your knight to g6. Black is having everything under control here. Let's see what happened. Queen e6, take, rook d7, bishop h4. So going for the exchange of bishops. And you got to be careful here, because if you don't do anything, knight g5 could be an idea here, trying to get rid of that defender of the bishop. King f3 once again runs into knight g5 with check, and after knight takes this, rook takes f2 with an in-between move, winning materials. On the next move you capture the knight. King f1 played, not ideal, but you had to get out of that pin along the second rank. Bishop takes f2, knight takes f2, and still black is 2 pawns up, but this rook is cutting off the king on the back rank, so it will be very difficult for black to make progress. a5, trying to push the pawn. Rook a7, and well, you got to think how to protect the pawn. In the game there followed rook to b5, protecting the pawn, attacking the pawn on c5. But now knight d3, knight comes back into play, protects the pawn on c5, and also this pawn on a5 is not able to come forward, as the rook is excellently placed behind that passed pawn, while keeping the king cut off at the same time as well. Knight g5, the knight comes into play, and here the rook comes to a6. So now Li wants to capture that pawn on c6. Things are heating up now at this point, as black is gonna be forced to give up that pawn. But how should black handle this situation? Is black able to push this pawn, or, well, maybe even try to use the other outside passed pawn? You can try to play h5 with the idea to go h4, and after rook takes c6, something like rook b3, putting pressure on the knight. And look at these 2 pawns, they are both very dangerous, and the rook is going to support both pawns, and together with the knight and the king on the back rank, there are still really good practical chances trying to win this game. But instead, there followed king f7. Understandably, black wants to activate her king, but after rook takes c6, rook b3, this knight has a problem, cannot go to f4 because of rook f3 with check, so don't do that. But king e2, using your king is very important. Black went for the move a4, so now black is only trying to use the a pawn, while the pawn on h6 is still there. Now rook a6, attacking the pawn on a4, a3, and here the big difference, knight f4 is played, which boxes in this king. The king is not able to come in via g6 to the center. The pawn on h5 is now covered by the knight as well. Rook c3, going after this pawn. c6. Very likely at some point White's going to give up her c pawn for the a pawn, and then it's a 2 versus 1 on one wing. Should be holdable for White. King e7, king d2, rook c4. Rook stays behind this passed pawn, hits the knight on f4. Knight d3, trying to bring the knight into the game, protecting the pawn on e5. King f7. Apparently the king was not able to approach the center because of White's pawns. They're taking away quite a number of squares. And also very important that now the pawn can just be taken. Rook takes c6, it's 2 versus 1. And now the knight comes back to f4, once again preventing the king from coming to g6. Rook c4, attacking the knight. You got to be careful. You cannot maintain that knight on f4 with king e3 as it runs into rook e4 check. As the knight protects the rook, king got to go away and then you capture the knight. So that's not possible. Rook a7, check, forcing the king to go backwards. And now White still is very active. And the only thing White needs to do to reach a draw here is get rid of the 2 remaining pawns. Even if that means that you have to sacrifice your knight for it. Rook and knight versus rook is a theoretical draw. But okay, that is something you only do in an emergency case. If you have the possibility just to keep the knight for without sacrificing and try to eliminate the pawns, that would be a much simpler way of holding the draw. But wait a second, knight f3 is played. It's a knight fork, check, king goes to e3, knight takes e5. Black is 2 pawns up, but these 2 pawns are very weak. Knight f4, attacking the pawn on e6. Black is not really able to make progress here. Went back with the rook to c6. Now king comes to e4, hitting the knight. Knight c4. Knight g6, check. Be careful, king g8 runs into knight e7 with a huge knight fork, winning the rook. That would be totally unfair if that would have happened. King e8 was played as a better move, but now the king comes to d4. And black is not really able to make progress. These pawns are weak. Knight b6 was played in the game. Rook e7 check, forcing the king to go even further away from the pawns. King d8. And now rook h7. So you're about to take the pawn on h6. Knight d7 played. Rook takes h6. And this pawn, it's not posing any serious problems. There followed the move e5. This is funny idea, so that you give a check and you're opening up the 6th rank for your rook, pinning the knight on g6. But look, knight takes e5 is there, and that is a very nice move, getting rid of that remaining pawn, with the point that after rook takes h6, there is knight f7, and on the next move you do capture the rook on h6. So here a draw was agreed between the 2 Chinese top players. I should mention though that also instead of rook takes h6, if you take on e5, then you swap the rooks, and with an extra knight only, you're not able to win the game. So this was a really hard-fought game, ended in a draw. I think Wenjun had very good winning chances with the extra pawns, but it was not that simple. And I think Li defended very well in this endgame. And you see that the match is still very interesting. I mean, Wenjun is a point behind, but let's see what she's able to do in her next game when she has the white pieces again. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.